Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. It's available on Pacifica Radio Network and iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and at opednews.com/podcasts, where the complete archives of the show are. This you're watching on video right now, but we also have older ones that were only available in audio. So glad to have you here. My guest for this show is Colleen Cowles. She's an attorney, an advocate, a mom with personal experience, and author of the new book, War on Us, How the War on Drugs and Myths About Addiction Are a War on All of Us. She's got an upcoming online course, Protecting Your Assets When Addiction Finds Your Family, and her website is waronus.com. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rob. It's great to be here. And thanks for your interest in a topic that's close to my heart. And
for this video, here's a copy of the book. You've got one flanking you there. So, it's a war on us. What's the goal of this book?
Mostly to show that the war on drugs not only has been a failure, but that it impacts every person. When I started this journey, which I certainly didn't plan, but it kind of landed in my lap with a couple of sons who ran into issues with the criminal justice system and addiction. I had a lot of preconceived notions that I think are pretty typical out there, that drug use was a choice, addiction was a choice, and that the criminal justice system and punitive measures could somehow protect our kids and could help us. The further I got into this, the more I realized that not only has it been, all of those assumptions are inaccurate, but also it's the approach to drug policy in this country has destroyed everything from healthcare for everyone to safety to civil liberties. I was astounded when I started looking at the true impact of drug policy on everyone's life, even if they've never tried an illegal drug.
What's the history that brought us to this place?
Well, what shocked me, I think all of us kind of assume that when we talk about changing drug policy, that's somehow radical. When you talk about particularly legalization of drugs, it scares people. But really, we've only had this major war on drugs in the last primarily 50 years. President Nixon in 1971 is the one that actually declared the war on drugs following the 1970 Controlled Substances Act, and that's when the DEA started scheduling drugs. In the late 1890s, the Sears and Roebuck catalog actually had a syringe and a small amount of cocaine for sale for $1.50. So the whole perception of making drugs illegal is a relatively new concept. And it's interesting when I started looking at that history that the approach to drug policy and the punitive measures have escalated at the same time that our addiction and overdose rates and our mass incarceration rates have escalated. So there's a direct correlation that shows us that it's not working.
I remember there was a movie done in the 20s or 30s around there by Harry Ainsley or something like that about the dangers of insane, crazy marijuana users.
Well, I actually remember I think it was 7th grade health class, where part of our health curriculum was being required to watch Reefer Madness. And I think
Reefer Madness.
I think that was the point in time that I started to really question whether anything that authorities were telling me was believable. So I don't think the movie did justice to what it was trying to accomplish.
So what was behind Reefer Madness, and what was behind this push to make drugs illegal, and who made this happen?
Well, unfortunately, it was largely racist. It's amazing the quotes from the proponents of the drug war, and unfortunately that continues in a lot of ways. Harry Anslinger was the in charge of the drug war from the early 30s into the early 60s. Blatant racist, outward quotes that are just astounding. And a lot of this really rose after Prohibition, alcohol prohibition, from 1919 to 1933, which I find interesting because we knew before we passed alcohol prohibition that we needed a constitutional amendment to authorize that. But somehow when that ended in 1933 and we had a lot of people employed in handling alcohol prohibition that would be out of jobs. And so they needed something to do. And somehow at that point, we came to the conclusion that we didn't need a constitutional amendment to prohibit drug use. So that was really the beginning of things. We have a quote from our counsel to President Nixon admitting that the promotion of the drug war was largely to keep blacks, those in opposition to the war and in some other groups in check, and admitting that they knew that what they were saying about drug use was actually inaccurate.
How many people have been incarcerated because they were charged with the use or possession of drugs?
You know, it's hard to come up with those numbers because which is frightening in and of itself. But because of county and state and U.S. Federal prisons and then worldwide, it's really difficult to come up with those numbers. But when we look at even on an annual basis, we have 1.6 million drug arrests. 1.4 million of those are strictly for possession. Over 600,000 arrests a year are still just for possession of cannabis. And if you internalize that and think of what that does, an arrest disrupts life, and sometimes for a lifetime, with criminal records and the impact of criminal records and the stigma and everything that goes with that. And if we look at 1.6 million people a year that are impacted, 1 in 3 American adults now has a criminal record. That's astounding. And most of those are for simple drug possession.
So, okay, so this goes back to Prohibition. Now, Prohibition was based on religion, right?
Largely, yes. The puritanical view that somehow it was immoral to put a substance into your body. And I think largely a lot of those attitudes prevail with the war on drugs. The challenge is that all of those attitudes really have promoted the addiction overdose epidemic. And when we make something illegal, we have never been good at controlling supply. So when we can't control supply, I mean, that's indicative of we can't even keep drugs out of prison, so I'm not sure how we can possibly think that we could keep them off the streets. But when we make something illegal, it creates the black market. With Prohibition, it created organized crime. With drugs, it's created the drug cartels. So we've basically forced people to derive their supply from sources that are very impure and with no regulation
and we're basically helping to fund criminal enterprises to the tune of billions of dollars.
Absolutely. A lot of the cartel money directly goes to fund terrorism, among other things. We've killed more people in Mexico alone through the war on drugs than those killed in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. I mean, it's horrendous what we're doing, not only nationally, but internationally.
Now, the title of the book is War on Us. Why is this war on us?
Well, when we look at the impact, it's not just about healthcare. The opioid epidemic, and there's questions about that terminology because the epidemic has really been caused largely by policy. But when we look at the impact of that on our healthcare. We started out with the FDA approving OxyContin. At the same time, the federal government promoted, and probably well-meaning, but promoted physicians to look at pain as a third rail, something that really needed to be treated. And so they were telling physicians to treat pain more aggressively at the same time that insurance companies were looking at coverage for pain medications instead of other types of protocols. So this really was created by policy. Now we find that there is a challenge with too many opioids hit the streets. But now, as of 2016, we had different prescribing guidelines given to physicians, and the DEA started rating physicians' offices, and licensing was questionable if a physician was deemed to be prescribing too many pain medications. Because of that, we now have massive amounts of pain patients who cannot get medications that have worked appropriately for them for decades. And some of the physicians, out of fear of being raided or losing their own livelihood or their own assets, are now not prescribing. Well, what's happening to those people are either in incredible pain, or they're being forced to turn into criminals and go to the street to get the medications that they've been on for years that were successful. So that impacts all of us. I mean, there are people that have stage 4 cancer that can't get medications to treat pain.
But on the other hand, people are dying. People are overdosing. Now, are they overdosing from the prescription medications they're getting on the black market, or are they overdosing from getting copycat medications like this Chinese fentanyl that's coming in?
That's a great question, Rob. One of the things that astounded me, I assumed going into this that a large degree of the problem was the prescription medications that were written by the physicians, and patients getting addicted to them. The statistics on that were shocking to me. There's less than a 1% overdose rate for the pain patient who goes to their doctor and gets prescriptions. Now there are some problems, largely from before, where some of those medications were diverted and people got them on the street. And absolutely, our problem really is the fentanyl. Because there are copycat medications, and sometimes people can't tell the difference. I mean, they've made them look very similar or identical to the actual pill. So if someone can't get their medications the way that they have historically through their doctor, and they're desperate, and they go to the street, their chances of overdosing on fentanyl, which is an additive to those street medications, the fentanyl overdoses have skyrocketed. So we've come back on opioids, and it's minimized the opioid overdoses, but it's really escalated fentanyl.
And from what I understand, most of this is coming from China.
A lot of it is coming from China. It's almost irrelevant. It's not irrelevant, but it is to a certain extent. Because whether we're talking about opioids and fentanyl now, a few years ago, the hot topic was meth. Before that, it was crack cocaine. I mean, we seem to want to attach ourselves to a particular drug or a particular challenge at the time, and or a particular area. I mean, we used to hear a lot about the Colombian drug cartels. Now they're the Mexican drug cartels. We don't shut them down; they just move.
So, but the thing is, these drugs hurt people.
Yes, and that's very personal to me.
What's the solution?
The solution is to regulate and to legalize so that we can regulate, so that we know that what's out there is pure, that we know the concentration levels, and that we're allowing people who have problems to come forward without risking being incarcerated or to be deemed an addict or be stigmatized for the rest of their lives. It's really not a lot different than the assessment that we've looked at for cannabis. And thankfully, we have moved forward with some legalization efforts there. I'm not a proponent of drug use. I don't think people should be be stigmatized or incarcerated for drug use, and based on personal family matters, I'm not minimizing the horrific issues with addiction. I mean, we're losing not only lives, but there is nothing that's more horrific for a parent than to see a child descending into addiction. I mean, it truly is horrific.
But you've been through that.
I've been through that. But as a parent, and whether it's my personal experience or someone who's looking at their innocent teenager or preteen and is concerned about their safety, would I be better off having my child, if they end up experimenting with drugs, would I be better off having that child be able to either come forward and ask for help, or as a parent, if I see that something's going on, being able to get them some help without risking having them put behind bars? And some of the emotional aspects of this, and it is emotional, I think, whether you've been through it personally or whether you see the impacts on society, but we now know that medications, no one treatment protocol is a one size fits all. But just as an example, medications have been proven, and this is according to our own government, have the statistically best success rate of treating addiction. And yet those medications are prohibited in the majority of jails and prisons. They're prohibited in most treatment groups. They're prohibited in most sober houses. Someone can actually be on medications in successful recovery, and if they miss a meeting with their probation officer because of an earlier arrest, they may be, and typically are, thrown in jail, and medications are prohibited. So then they're going through withdrawal in jail behind bars, and when they're released, they're depressed, they're stigmatized, and their tolerance levels are now down. So their chances of a relapse and an overdose have just skyrocketed astronomically because they missed an appointment or didn't meet the level of perfection within our probation system that usually is 2 to 3 years of expectation that you're going to be perfect. So we're killing people with our policies.
Now you talk about how there are myths about addiction.
Yeah.
What are they?
Yeah, there are several out there. One of them is that abstinence is the only way to recovery, and that has been promoted by 12 Steps. 12 Steps has helped many people, but it's not a fix-all. It's a peer support group. It's not medical treatment. The majority of people who end up with addiction problems are self-medicating either physical or emotional medical issues. And a peer support group is not in a position to treat that. And yet we have a criminal justice system where my profession, the legal profession, is dictating the medications allowed and dictating what treatment is allowed for a medical issue. I mean, to me, that's crazy. I can tell you, in law school, I was not trained to have any proficiency whatsoever on how to treat addiction or what medication should be used. So the whole idea that abstinence is the only way and there's one way and we're going to dictate that type of treatment, and if you don't accept that, we're going to throw you in jail, that's a huge myth. Another myth is if I try a drug, I'm going to be addicted. Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody go out and try a strong drug, because addiction is horrendous. But the reality is that 10 to 20% of people who try drugs across the board, and that includes heroin and meth and all of what we consider the really, really serious drugs, 10 to 20%. And the reason there's a range is it depends on whether you look at cannabis, and because there's more people who use cannabis, there's about a 9% addiction rate on cannabis. But it's easy for the 80 to 90% who don't have the propensity, that might be environmental, there's a lot of reasons that someone has a propensity toward addiction. But when you're in that 80 to 90% and you've tried a drug and it hasn't, you haven't been addicted, you look at the other person and say, well, why don't they just stop? And yet the physical and emotional makeup of that person who ends up with an addiction is different than the person with the 80 to 90%.
So what you're saying is that some people are at much higher risk than others.
Absolutely. And that really goes to the whole choice question. I mean, is addiction a choice? I don't know. Is drug use a choice? Certainly. Someone chooses to take a drug or to put a needle in their arm. But is it really a choice as far as something that just say no and you can stop? Because that myth really has dictated our entire drug policy.
Which is based on some kind of a moral idea that you are doing wrong rather than you were a kid, you tried it, and then you got hooked. All right, we need to take a brief break. We're going to pause for 10 seconds so I can insert the bumpers into the audio version of the show. Colleen Cowles. No, let me do this again. My guest for the show is Colleen Cowles. She's an attorney, an advocate, a mom with personal experience, and author of the new book, War on Us, How the War on Drugs and Myths About Addiction Are a War on All of Us. So you talk about there are 10 ways the war on drugs is a war on all of us. What are the 10 ways?
Without looking at the book, I don't know if I can exactly tell you the 10 ways, but healthcare. Safety, we have whether it's drug cartels or whether it's police being so involved with looking for people with drugs that we're the rates of unsolved rape and burglary and pedophilia and murder, serious crimes are not being solved. While so much focus is spent on drug policy, and there's some reasons for that. There are major grants for law enforcement, so it's more lucrative for them to focus on drug crime.
What you say major? Is there like a percentage of police budgets that are funded by this war on drugs?
Yes, there's a lot of funding for the war on drugs. There's also a great way for, and this depends on jurisdiction, but civil forfeiture law gives, in many jurisdictions, gives police incentive to go after what they perceive as drug issues. Because if there is a perceived problem and there's no conviction or even charge required, assets can be seized, including a parent's home. The statistics on that are pretty amazing as well. As of 2014, the government seized more assets under civil forfeiture than all burglaries combined. In 2017, there were $8.5 billion in assets seized through civil forfeiture. And it was I think it was 3.4 billion in all burglaries combined. So we have our government stealing more from us than burglars.
Wow.
And a percentage of that in some jurisdictions, and there is change going on here. There has been some reform, but in many jurisdictions, a percentage of those assets seized can be retained by the police departments to fund their own programs. So, as far as other areas that are impacted, immigration. We have immigration issues because of people coming from Latin American countries that have been just decimated by the war on drugs, and where people aren't having opportunities. All of our finances are impacted. We've spent over $1 trillion in the United States alone fighting the war on drugs since 1971. And what we've bought for that money is that the United States has the highest addiction rates, the highest overdose rates, and the highest incarceration rates in the world. There's a racist component that I think is horrific for all of us and affects all of us. We have more African Americans in prison right now than there were slaves prior to the Civil War. We have more arrests than in apartheid at the height in South Africa. So it's socially, it's devastation. And maybe we would have to look at it more closely if it worked, but we're clearly ignoring science and medicine. You know, we were talking about choice earlier. What really turned my attitudes around was looking at the medications that are available to treat addiction. If we can cut the overdose rate, and these are statistics from the U.S. government, if we can cut the overdose rate by 50% through using medications, then how many people do we have sitting in jail just because they didn't have access to the right medical care? So, and if we're questioning whether addiction and drug use is a moral failing, well, people who get the right medications and respond to those don't change their morals, but their addiction is, they end up in recovery.
Are there other examples around the world where they have done what you're recommending, which is to regulate drugs instead of make them illegal?
Yes, and there have been some phenomenal successes. Unfortunately, in the late 1960s, the United States helped pass the first UN treaty, and those treaties make it very, very difficult for countries to experiment. We basically exported our punitive drug policy and mandated it through UN treaties, and there have been several treaties since then. Because of that, most of the countries that talk about, including Portugal is a great example, have decriminalized. And there's a difference between decriminalization and legalization. But decriminalization is a little easier to justify under the UN treaties than outright legalization. The benefit of outright legalization is that it does allow for regulation and monitoring of sale of drugs. In decriminalization, you're making drug possession not a crime. And sometimes it's just a lesser crime, depends on the jurisdiction. But it doesn't allow for distribution, whether it's by the government or by private industry monitored by the government. That's not allowed unless it's legalization.
So now we have in many states legalization of marijuana for recreational use. Where does that fit into this UN treaty?
Well, it's interesting because I think that and you end up jumping through these legal hoops that are a little bit crazy, but we can justify that because it's states, and individual states are not parties to the UN treaty. So technically, the UN treaties may be part of the issue with the federal government addressing this issue. Having said that, the United States has a lot of clout with the UN, and the UN councils have basically been begging for change in policy and either repeal or adjustment on these treaties. So the United States could do some phenomenal things with working with the UN and freeing up countries to be able to experiment more.
I have some personal experience that's relevant to this. In '93, I went to Russia, and I went with the connections of a director of one of the medical institutes there. And he hooked me up to meet with the head of the Russian Academy of Medical Sciences, which is the equivalent of being the head of NIH. I had lunch with him and chatted with him. And when I got back, somehow somebody from the FDA got wind of that. And I got a call from the FDA saying, can you help us to get Russia to adopt our policies and laws? So basically, they're looking to evangelize federal U.S. government regulations regarding drugs and devices worldwide.
Absolutely, and they've used federal aid and pretty much every weapon in the quiver to promote that. We are seeing a movement, though, and I think it's because of the devastation of the punitive drug policy worldwide. We are seeing a movement where more and more countries are saying, you know, we have to do something differently. Portugal has been an incredible testimony to what can be done. They were about 15, 16 years ago, they were very much where we are right now as far as high heroin addiction rates, high overdose rates, high HIV rates, and they decided they just needed to do something different. So they decriminalized all drugs. So the results have been phenomenal. They have the lowest addiction and overdose rates in Europe. I don't remember the statistic. I have all of the statistics in the book, but they put us to shame as far as the success rates and it happened quickly. They help people who want to come forward with getting medical treatment. They help them in moving them into the workforce, and it has removed, to a vast degree, the stigma involved. So, and now there still are illegal drug suppliers because it's not legal, it's decriminalized there. But those changes have, there's no doubt that it's saved incredible numbers of lives and then qualities of life, you know, where people can actually get help when they want to get help.
I know in some countries they don't have the same kind of rules for getting access to prescription drugs. Mm-hmm. In Mexico, for example, you can get a lot of drugs that here are only available by prescription. You can get them over the counter there.
Correct.
Are you talking about ideally making these available over the counter without prescription or with prescription?
I think it would depend on the individual drug. The challenge with making them available across the board with no pharmacist or medical help involved is, it is important to understand the interactions of drugs. You know, so each individual medication would need to be looked at, and what I'm proposing is that we start really looking at that, because right now our schedules make no sense. In the Controlled Substances Act, cannabis is Schedule 1, saying that there is no medicinal value whatsoever. That's, I mean, there's no logic to our law. And a lot of our drug policy right now is government sanctioned stigma. So we need to remove that. If we looked at everything through the prism of addiction being a health issue rather than a crime, it would change our world.
So you've taken a look at my book, BottomUp Revolution.
Yes.
And you told me that you had some thoughts on how bottom-up and top-down thinking apply to this war on us and the drug regulation problem.
Absolutely. I think this is probably, and you know, obviously this is personal to me, but when I look at any other topic, there might be freedoms, which are very important. There might be economics that are very important. But when I look at this topic, it's literally whether someone gets to live or die, or whether they're behind bars or free. And our drug policy is the most egregious example I've ever seen of top down. We aren't looking at what's right for the individual medical needs of an individual person. We're not looking at what a community needs as far as distribution of substances and provision of medical care. We're not looking at what needs socially are there. We now know scientifically and medically that addiction is escalated by isolation and trauma. So the top-down approach has been isolation and trauma, and then we wonder why addiction is escalated. And we have more people in prison today than anywhere else in the world. And when those people get out, they are fundamentally changed. And yet we're not looking at it from what is needed from an individual person or communities or families' needs. It's dictated. It's very dictatorial. And there's a challenge with that because it's difficult for politicians. I mean, this last week is a good example with Pete Buttigieg coming out and saying he thinks all drugs should be decriminalized, and he's been attacked on a lot of levels for that. That's a good example of why a lot of politicians don't stand up and say this, even though behind closed doors a lot of them are. But they're scared to death that if they promote this, and if one person ends up doing something bad or having a bad situation, they're going to be tied to that, and it can be career ending. But what they're not looking at is all of the people whose lives have been either lost or destroyed with our current policies. But top makes it hard to change.
It's cowardice.
It is. It is.
They're hiding behind a law that might stop one person, but in the process, it destroys the lives of tens of thousands, of hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. That's exactly what's happening.
Yeah. So you say there are 12 groups that profit from the war on drugs, and who are they?
Well, a lot of it is there's a lot of money to be made. And anytime you have something that is mandated for 50 years, you are going to have an industry that ends up making a lot of money from those those policies. So we've got prosecutor and law enforcement lobbies are very strong, although even they are starting to talk about doing things differently. But for law enforcement, it's a lot easier to be able to stop someone and say, I smelled some cannabis. I mean, basically, any of us can be searched at any point because of the search for drugs. It's not that we did something wrong, but if we have something in our possession or can be accused of having something in our possession, then it's easier for police to do their jobs. We've got a lot of private profit. We hear a lot about private prisons. That only handles 6% of prisoners, but those are pretty horrendous. When we've got private prisons who have all kinds of incentive to not provide the services, right down to appropriate food and medical care and that kind of thing. What a lot of people don't know is that the contracts between governments and prisons actually mandate minimum occupancy rates. And the governments are fined if those occupancy rates aren't filled. So think of that as far as conflict of interest, where we have the government fined if they don't fill the prisons. And then we wonder why we have mass incarceration. We have bail bond companies that have fought criminal justice reform on tooth and nail. I mean, these are billion-dollar companies. If you're arrested for anything and you don't want to sit in jail, and right now I think it's 1 in 5 that are in jail right now aren't there because they have been convicted of a crime. They're there because they can't afford to pay a bail. So if your bail is set on even $50,000 of bail, in order for a bail bond to work, you have to come up with $5,000. It's typically 10%. And even if you're acquitted of that crime, they keep the $5,000. So, and bail is set higher or lower. I mean, this is prohibitive. So this is a good gig for a company. You get 10%.
Now, I know that in Chicago, Cook County, the bail is held, and then a lot of lawyers, it works differently. There, a lot of lawyers will accept the bail deposit as the payment for their services. So the lawyers are benefiting too.
Yes. Well, and there's a whole criminal justice, legal component here that definitely benefits. And then we've got all of the services, whether it's a private prison or a government prison or jail. There is huge money being made on things like canteen, on phone services, on video services, on any type of communication with family. And there really are no restrictions on how much those can be charged. Even deposits into the canteen there are surcharges, and there are minimums of how little or how much can be put into canteen. So someone can, if they charge a minimum amount to deposit into the canteen account so that the inmate can pay for some of the basic needs or a snack or something. It's not that you can put in a large amount all at once. There's minimums so that they are pretty much guaranteed their rates. Rates can fluctuate. Mother's Day, rates go up in order to communicate with your mother.
Yeah.
So there's some pretty horrendous things that go on. We've gone to video services now where even in a county jail, we'll have inmates that can be there. They're not supposed to be there over a year. A year is a long time. Who never see the sun. They're in quarters for a year, and now with video, they never see or are able to touch a family member during that period of time. They can communicate by video, which usually is very grainy. There's all kinds of people screaming in the background. It's truly a horrendous thing. And then we wonder why reentry is a problem, because if they're cut off from those kinds of connections, it not only escalates the risk of relapse and addiction afterward, but it causes problems with reentry.
Okay, and we need to take another break now. I also need a pause because my battery is running low. I have to plug things in here. So hold on. And my guest for this show is Colleen Cowles. She's an attorney and the author of the new book, War on Us: How the War on Drugs and Myths About Addiction Are a War on All of Us. And you're telling us about the different groups that profit from the war on drugs.
Yes.
Keep going.
Cheap labor is a huge one. There are many companies that contract with the prison systems, and I don't know if that's a bad thing as far as those companies. If all of the companies can do it to be competitive, I guess they need to. But the idea that prisoners are working for sometimes 30 cents a day, and sometimes in jobs that they would not be able to get when they're released from prison because of their criminal record. An example of
what's really ironic about that is recently Mike Bloomberg hired a company to provide services that used prisoner workers. And I'm sure that if he had known that, he would have never have done it. I'm sure it was not intentional. And I wonder how many companies are hiring contractors to do work that are subcontracting that work to prisoners, maybe prisoners who are in jail because they got caught with a joint.
Right. Yeah, I think that probably happens in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
One of the crazy examples recently with the California wildfires, prisoners were paid $2 a day to go and fight the fires. But when they are released from prison, they can't be a firefighter because of their criminal record. So there's so many examples of that. But when we look at that and where the incentives are, if you have companies that are able to get very, very cheap labor, and the prisons are able to retain part of the payment. So all of the incentives are exactly the opposite of what should be there as far as a sane system. All of those incentives are there on promoting mass incarceration and retaining people there for as long as they possibly can.
Okay, some other beneficiaries of the war on us.
Well, the pharmaceutical companies are culprits. An example of that, when a few years ago, when the medical marijuana law in Arizona, or actually it was the recreational marijuana law in Arizona, was defeated, the largest donor to the opposition was a pharmaceutical company. And very shortly after that, that bill was defeated, that company developed a pharmaceutical using THC to sell. So there's a direct conflict of interest there as well. I mean, we run into that a lot with pharmaceuticals versus natural medications, because there's money to be made on a lot of the natural medications.
I would think that a pharmaceutical, the pharmaceutical lobby would oppose marijuana, because a lot of people would smoke marijuana instead of taking tranquilizers or antidepressants or pain relievers.
Exactly, or some of the pharmaceutical THC. So yeah, again, a direct conflict of interest there. We also have a huge treatment industry. And unfortunately, with the Affordable Care Act, that did expand coverage for treatment for substance use disorder. It also created a huge issue with patient brokering, with enormous amounts of money being made, not because they were actually providing viable treatment services, but because they were funneling patients in and out of treatment. A lot of times, the most effective treatment is not the most expensive, but we have this industry that has grown up, and again, 12 Steps has helped some people, but we have the $40,000 to $60,000 28-day treatment programs, and you know, those industries are not fast to change.
I would imagine that there are judges that say you can go to jail or you can go to one of these $40,000 to $60,000 treatment programs.
Well, more typically, the judge will say you can either go to jail or you can go to the treatment program with which we have a contract. And those are largely 12-step, which is, by the way, unconstitutional, because those are faith-based programs dictated by government. But who is going to question that when you're the person that the judge can put in jail? Yeah, basically we have judges, or more typically prosecutors, because usually it doesn't get to the judge. 97% of all criminal cases are
negotiated
on plea agreements. And that's because we have such horrendous sanctions. I mean, you can have a couple of pills in your pocket and be looking at 7 years in jail. So who's going to go to trial and take that risk? So you're at the complete mercy of the prosecutor. In a lot of cases, the prosecutor has the right to be able to increase the charges against you if you opt not to accept the plea agreement and decide to go to trial. So the prosecutors' lobbies are very strong as far as opposing criminal justice reform.
Now that has begun to change. Like here in Philadelphia, we have a prosecutor who is very enlightened. How is that different?
Well, I think that Seattle, at this point, the prosecutor is no longer making arrests for any type of drug possession. So we are seeing reforms, and I think that I don't want to paint any, whether it's one size fits all treatment for addiction, or whether it's any type of industry. There are, in every industry, whether it's law enforcement or prosecution or treatment, all of these areas are starting to see the devastation that's been caused by current policy. So I think that, and when we've got 1 in every 3 families directly involved, and 2 out of 3 indirectly involved with someone who has suffered from substance use disorder, there's more and more people in those positions who are seeing some personal impact, and they're looking at things differently. So we are definitely making some progress. We have a long way to go, but we are definitely making some progress in reforms.
Now, you didn't mention the alcohol industry. I would think that they would probably lobby against it too.
I haven't seen statistics on that, but I would venture to say that is probably a fair assumption.
Yeah, but you've added some extra ones. Now, you say there are 10 reasons why conservatives should want to end the war on drugs.
Yes. Well, if conservatives are opposed to a nanny state, this is the essence of a nanny state, where government is dictating. It's interesting how the conventional wisdom is that parents should not advocate for their children. You're supposed to let them hit bottom, kick them to the curb, just say no. Now, all of that. And yet our drug policy does just exactly the opposite, not in a bottom-up family caring mode, but in a top-down, you will do this and you will be perfect for the next 3 years while you are on probation, while you call in and report for everything you do. And if you mess that up, even irritate your probation officer or miss an appointment or any number of things, we're going to put you behind bars. Where addiction typically has relapse as part of it. And
well, wait, let me reframe that then, okay? Because, conservatives hate government. And here we have a situation where it's all about government. It's total invasion of government into people's lives rather than giving them the freedom to make their own choices and take their own responsibilities. And it's created an incredibly huge bureaucracy too.
Yes.
Taken away.
Conservatism, does not exist when we look at drug policy.
And it takes away from the family and the community ability to make choices and help people. It takes away from the local family doctor's ability to do anything.
Absolutely. Now, and it takes away from the state government's ability to do something.
And you said there are 10 reasons why conservatives should want to end the war on drugs. What are some other ones?
Some other ones, when I look at ideology and philosophy, the NRA should be the largest organization proposing drug policy reform of anyone. Because the whole essence of the NRA argument is that taking guns away from people doesn't solve gun violence. Well, then why would we believe that trying to control drug supply will solve our addiction problem?
Okay. Keep going. More reasons?
Fiscal conservatism. If we are looking at allowing families to take care of themselves, individuals to take care of themselves, and local governments to determine what makes sense for those local governments, then having federal policy that is prohibiting the state governments from doing what they see fit is directly in opposition to that. The cannabis movement is a good example of that. Now we're starting to see some movement potentially on the federal level, but right now those dispensaries in the states where cannabis is legal literally have to pay their taxes in bags of cash. The federal government is spending huge amounts of money just to pay for monitoring the cash payments. We're escalating the potential for crime when we're not only paying taxes in cash, but they're required to pay for everything else in cash. The difficulty in banking. The difficulty in interstate commerce is all complicated when the federal government is usurping power of the states. Now, thankfully, we are making some movement here where the federal government has now said that they won't be going after the individual states, but that could change at any time. I mean, technically, the federal government does have the power. Technically, anyone using cannabis in a state, even if it's legal in that state, is still breaking federal law. So just the consistency in government and allowing citizens to understand the policies.
Are there any other reasons that conservatives should want to end the war on drugs?
Due process. We have completely lost due process when we have 97% of cases never going to trial, and basically not, our system would absolutely implode if every drug case was going to trial, because there's no way that we could possibly litigate 1.6 million arrests in a year. So instead, we have dictatorial policies that take away due process. So if you're a constitutional conservative, that it flies directly in the face of that belief.
Now, we're going to have to wrap in a couple minutes. You talk about the war on housing, the war on parents. What is that?
Housing, I don't know if people realize that someone with a pill in their pocket can end up with a felony. In fact, you don't even have to have a pill in your pocket. If you have a substance in your blood, that can be enough to have a felony. If you have a felony, you will likely never rent again. Federal housing, public housing will largely be denied. There are some exceptions, but largely denied. Any type of rental agreement, you're not going to be able to rent as a felony. You can go to a sober house, but that sober house very well may dictate that you have to attend 12-step meetings, whether that's working for you or not. May mandate that you cannot use the medications that are working for you. And for families, sometimes that's difficult, because if you end up on probation in one county and your family lives in the other county, even if they would allow you to live with them, you can't move out of that county without going through incredible amounts of paperwork and never knowing what the rules in that new county are going to be.
So these laws are anti-family then?
Anti-family, independence. How is someone supposed to find a job with a felony, and you can't move out of that county, and you probably don't have housing? So from a taxpayer perspective, and just from a compassion perspective, we are sanctioning failure.
So we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I just want to cover a couple of things. So it seems to me like one problem is there's a very high-level, top-down set of laws that have been put into place. The UN, federal laws, they have to be changed. How do they get changed?
They will get changed bottom up. The only way that this will change is bottom up, and it really doesn't even have to be partisan. Historically, both parties have not done well on this topic. But as more and more of us start looking at any policy through the prism of, is this policy treating addiction and as a medical issue rather than a crime, and holding the policymakers accountable for the issues that are being caused, then we will see change. And I think on another personal level, every one of us can save lives. There are nasal sprays that we can carry that help to save lives. We can minimize.
What are the nasal sprays?
It's called naloxone, and it's just a
Narcan. It's Narcan.
Narcan is the trade name, correct?
It blocks opiates.
Yes, it will revive someone from an overdose and save a life. We have test strips where you can test whether there's fentanyl in a drug. Prince's life could have been saved for $2 with a test strip. Even our terminology. We don't say to a parent who has a child suffering from leukemia, how is your cancer? But we ask a parent whose child is suffering from substance use disorder, how is your addict? And language can, I know that there's a lot of criticism to political correctness, but we do stigmatize people with our language.
Okay, so I want to get back to one thing. You said that the way this is going to change is bottom up. How? What does that look like?
Well, elections matter. Speaking out matters. Asking the right questions matters. Drug courts have been promoted as this solve-all problem. A lot of huge amounts of money have been put into drug courts with the idea of, oh, a drug court, allows for treatment. What that's ended up doing is giving more money and more power to the judges and the prosecutors.
So have you talked to politicians? Have you talked to legislators at all?
Yes, quite extensively, actually. And behind doors, most of them understand the problem. Some of them are willing to start stepping up. But what they have told me is until we know that our constituents understand this issue and will accept change without blaming us, we will not see change.
I mean, are there national organizations that people can check out?
There are a lot of organizations, depending on what you're looking for. Drug Policy Alliance does good work in this area. Normal is an organization promoting and working with the cannabis legalization. There are many.
Okay, and we need a wrap. My guest for the show has been Colleen Cowles. She's an advocate and attorney, and she's the author of the book War on Us: How the War on Drugs and Myths About Addiction Are a War on All of Us. Her website is waronus.com. Colleen, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Rob.